Okay, you have 2 minutes, and then Linda's going to come up. 2 minutes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Linda. Hi. Good to see you. When we were, it was a number of months ago now, Greg got a bunch of people together to start talking about TBD and what we would do and brainstorming about some possible studies for this year. And we settled on this theme of wisdom and did James in the first section. And we're doing, I believe it's Sermon on the Mount in the next one, which was great with me. But my favorite one, the one I was most excited about, was this one, The Life of Solomon. I love character studies. I love the Old Testament. So I was really excited to do this one. But one of the challenging things about narratives and character studies is we do not have full information. We look at the actions. We have the recorded actions and the recorded words, a few of them from someone's life, and then we're left trying to discern a bunch of things we don't know. Why did they do that? What drove them to that? How does this match up with that? And we have questions. And as the start of this study came closer, Greg and I had some casual chats about Solomon, and we realized something really interesting. We look at the same verses, the same actions of this guy, the same words that he said, and he and I came to different conclusions about Solomon. One of us thinks Solomon is a believer, knows the Lord, but struggles with his sin nature, struggles with his desires, struggles with his lust, and he's got a divided heart, and he's always waffling back and forth between love of the Lord and love of the world. And the other of us thinks that Solomon knows about the Lord, but doesn't have a genuine faith. And the reason for that, holding that opinion, is that the last word God has to say about Solomon in the Word is one of judgment. And that was kind of fascinating that we look at his life, both of us, the same information, and we come to differing conclusions. And I was thinking about that when I was doing my homework last week and thinking, really, we have the same dilemma looking at Solomon's life as the world has when it looks at ours. It looks at the actions that we do, it looks at the words that we say, and then it sees if they are coherent, if there is hypocrisy between them. Or they might say, oh, she says this, but she did that. And they wonder about the state of our faith. Is it real? Is it hypocritical? Are we genuinely what we say we are? And that there's a reason that God says, by their fruits you will know them, because we only have each other's exterior life by which to evaluate what is true about our spiritual walk with God. People look at your life and that's what they do. They judge you by what they can see. And we have the same problem with Solomon. So, as we consider the story of Solomon, use his life as a little bit of a mirror. Hold it up to yourself and ask yourself if you see anything about you in Solomon's life. Is there anything familiar in there that you see? Are there some things that he does that are familiar in a good way, or some things that are familiar perhaps in a convicting way? God doesn't use the stories of the Old Testament as filler just to get us from creation to the important stuff in the life of Jesus. These stories are in there for a reason. They're visuals of people who walked with God, who sinned, who failed, who experienced his grace and his forgiveness, or people who did not know God that he pursued, some of whom turned to him, some of whom did not, and ended up in judgment. They are meant to show us our own lives. They might live in a different culture, they might live in a different time, but when it comes to human nature, there's nothing new under the sun. And so we will often see ourselves in the stories of the Old Testament. So have a look as we go through Solomon, have a look at his life and then say to yourselves, where am I in his story? This is what I love about character studies. For me, I can read a passage that tells me, oops, I'm turning myself off here. No, I'm not. I can read a story, a passage that tells me how to live, that tells me you don't have malice, don't have greed, don't do this, don't do that. And I go, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I read a story where someone exhibits it, and I go, oh, actually, that looks familiar. And it's kind of ugly, and I do that, and I need to change it. So I find myself convicted by the stories of God's word. And I hope Solomon does that for you. In general, Solomon's life is a warning. Greg and I have differing opinions about him, but we both agree on that. Solomon's life is a warning. At its best, it is a warning. Hang on a sec. It is a warning about knowing the Lord and living with a divided heart, and struggling between your nature, your desires, and what is of God. At its worst, it's a warning about knowing about God, but not having genuine faith, and ending in judgment. The passage we're in this week is the spiritual high point of Solomon's life. He has another good moment at the prayer of the dedication of the temple, but for the most part, it's downhill from here, badly. He spirals into abject failure in his life. This is the shining moment for Solomon in his interaction with God. And before we have a look specifically at this, let me give you a little bit of context. We learned last week Solomon is not the oldest of David's sons. He's got several older brothers. He's not the youngest. David and Bathsheba had at least 2 children younger than Solomon, but Solomon is among the younger ones. Scholars estimate he is between 17 and 20 years of age when his father died and he became king. He is young. He is short on experience and short on maturity. And he has a daunting task. Kings in the ancient world are the lawgivers of their nation. They are the judge for hard disputes. They are the ones who must lead at the head of armies when you go to battle. They are the spiritual leaders. They are the maker of treaties and the ones who control all the public works projects. They have the responsibility for the prosperity and safety of their entire nation on their shoulders. This is a huge and overwhelming task, and Solomon is really young. Stepping into a role like this, there are 2 ways Solomon could respond. First, he could have been focused on the very real privileges and power that he is gaining. He is an absolute monarch, which means anything he wants, he can have, no limits. He wants your stuff, he can have it. He can have the best of the food, the best of the clothing, the best of the animals, the best house, the best of everything. And what he wants, he demands, and he gets. And that is a recipe for just wallowing in filling our hearts with, and our minds and our lives with all the things that we desire, because there are no limits He could just indulge himself. Or he could consider the weight of the responsibility of this new job. He could consider the people that he is responsible for. And that's a heavy load for a young guy with no experience. In verse 8, it said, Solomon knew it was the Lord who made him king. God put him in over his head. Now, have you ever been asked to take on something for God in ministry and you knew it was more than you could do? I have. It wasn't anywhere near as big as what Solomon got handed, but I have. And I know what it's like. Solomon has this inexperience and he has this corresponding fear. God does this kind of thing all the time. He loves to take the inexperienced, the young, the fearful, the inadequate, and put them in over their heads. Because when he does that, we get to see his power and his grace, and we learn dependence on him. It's not wrong for Solomon to look at himself and feel inadequate, to say, I can't do that. He was dead right. He couldn't. It wasn't wrong for me to look at the thing God asked me to do and say, I cannot do that. In fact, one of the wonderful things about Solomon here is that he has honesty and he has humility. He's not acting in pride. He's not arrogant. He knows his own limitations. It's not our weakness. It's not our weakness or our inadequacy that is the issue. We all have those. It's how we respond to God when he asks us to do something anyway. And there are 3 possible ways you could respond when he does that to you. One very common one is, let's say someone from Southridge asks you to take on something and you think, I can't do that. Our first reaction is usually to say, that person doesn't realize that they have asked the wrong person, and you just say no. You say no without praying. You say no without asking God if he wants you to do it. You just assume that you know that this is not for you, and you say no. Without realizing, you might actually be rejecting a call of God on your life. The second thing that people might do is what I did. I didn't want to do what God was asking me to do, but I knew he was calling. So I came up with every excuse in the book, and I basically said to God, you have not thought this through. You have not understood my inadequacies. You have not considered my schedule, the conflicts that I have, the things that I have going on, and all the reasons why I cannot do it. And God ripped them out from under me one after the other, and I came up with more. Until finally God said, you sound an awful lot like Moses. And I thought, ooh, God got mad at Moses. And I was concerned. And eventually God made clear to me that I do not have the right to decide what he calls me to do. I only have the right to decide if I'm going to obey. And I didn't want to disobey, so I submitted and said that I would do it. But that was not my finest moment. But the third way a person could respond when God asks them to do something they don't know how to do is what Solomon did. And this is actually really beautiful. Solomon had gone down to Gibeon, to the altar of the Lord. He sacrificed there. And then the Lord told him he could have anything he wanted. Solomon, what would you like me to give you? And Solomon knew what he needed. He knew what he did not have. He knew his own inadequacies and fears, but he also knew that God had what he did not have. He knew that God could provide him and give to him what he was unable to do for himself. And he said, in essence, to God, I'm just a child. I can't do this job. But then in faith, he asked God for what he needed, for the wisdom and knowledge to lead his nation well. And God gave it generously. And God was pleased with Solomon that he did not just think of selfish things. He was pleased with Solomon that he wanted to do well at the job God had called him to. And so God gave not only the wisdom and the knowledge that Solomon requested, but he gave him things he had not asked for. wealth, possessions, and honor. And so, God equips those he calls. He doesn't always equip us first. That's important to know. He does not equip you first and then call you. He usually calls first and waits for your obedience before he shows you how he has equipped you, before he gives you what you need. Because he's looking for your dependence. He's looking for your faith. And I found that to be true in my situation. He called me. I said no. I finally submitted. I said yes. And only then did I begin to see how he had already given me what I needed to do the job that he had called me for. He waits until we obey before he reveals what he has given. But he can be counted on to give you what you need. He did it for Solomon, and he'll do it for you. Now, this is the high point spiritually in the life of Solomon. And if you're young, that's really encouraging because he has a really fantastic moment of faith here at a very young age. So God can do great things in a young life, but it's also really discouraging because he reigned for 40 years. He died when he was in his late 50s or perhaps 60, and the high point of his life spiritually and his walk with God was decades in the past. And that would be a sad way to end your life, that the high point of your life in your walk with God was 40 years ago. No one wants that example to follow. Now, I tend to ask probing questions when I teach. Greg calls them pokey, so I'm going to do it now. I'm going to ask you a pokey question. I'm going to ask you at first I'm not going to put anything else on the screen for a second. I'm going to ask you to spend the first couple of minutes here in silence. And I'm going to ask you, just between you and God, to ask God if there's something he has asked you to do and you have dismissed it, rejected it, refused to do it because of your inadequacy. We all want to feel capable, but God wants us to be dependent. And so take a moment and ask God to show you if you have tuned out his call out of your own sense of fear and your own lack of faith in his provision. And maybe ask God to forgive you for that and give you another opportunity to try again. In a couple of minutes, I'll come back up. Without saying anything, I'll put a couple of discussion questions on the screen for the next few minutes of discussion. And then when I come back up again, we're going to talk a little bit about wisdom. All right. Well, I wish I could have heard your discussion about defining wisdom, but let's just work through a little bit here about what Solomon asked for and what it was he got. So, the sort of wisdom we're speaking about is not human wisdom, it's the wisdom of God. God is its source. And you referred back to James chapter 3 in your study books regarding these two types of wisdom, the wisdom of the world and then the wisdom of God. And the Bible gives us some direction in understanding wisdom. Again, two verses that were in the study. Proverbs 28 says, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." And Proverbs 9:10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So the basis of wisdom is a worldview in which you hold to the truth that there is a God, that he is to be reverenced and obeyed, and that what he says matters in your life. Now, in contrast, Psalm 14, verse 1, the first part of the verse says, we have the opposite worldview here, and this says, "The fool said in his heart, there is no God." So the opposite from wisdom is foolishness, and this is a different worldview that basically says God does not exist. What God has to say does not matter. He has no relevance to my life, and I can ignore him. And these two worldviews form either the basis of wisdom or the basis of foolishness. Now, Solomon wrote a large portion of the book of Proverbs. And if you got all the way to the last set of questions in the study this week, you would have looked at chapter 1 of Proverbs. In Proverbs, Solomon uses a literary device called personification. Personification is when you take an abstract concept and you give it human characteristics for the purposes of teaching or expressing it. It's quite common in poetry, which Proverbs is. And in Proverbs, he uses this literary device for wisdom and for foolishness by personifying both of them as women. And this is spread through all the book, but let's just read a few of these, starting with what he has to say about wisdom personified. So Proverbs 8, we're going to read 1, 4 to 8, 12 to 14, and 22 to 33. "Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? To you, O people, I call out. I raise my voice to all mankind. You who are simple, gain prudence. You who are foolish, set your hearts on it. Listen, for I have trustworthy things to say. I open my lips to speak what is right. My mouth speaks what is true. My lips detest wickedness. All the words of my mouth are just. None of them is crooked or perverse. I, wisdom, dwell together with prudence. I possess knowledge and discretion. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech. Counsel and sound judgment are mine. I have insight and I have power. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works, before his deeds of old. I was formed long ago, at the very beginning when the world came to be. And then he speaks about foolishness, again as a woman. And in this particular case, this foolish woman is meeting a young man in the streets. Folly is an unruly woman. She is simple and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious. But little do they know that the dead are there, that her guests are deep in the realms of the dead. So, to try to nail down just what wisdom is, it's based on a reverence for God. It is living the attributes of God, the ways of God, the attitudes and values of God in situations where we do not have clear instruction. If we have clear instruction on something, we don't need wisdom, we just need obedience. If you notice that your neighbor had left his chainsaw out at the end of his driveway, kind of half under a bush, and it sat there for 3 days, and you thought to yourself, I need a chainsaw. I could go down there tonight after dark and put that thing in the back of my car and take it home. You don't need wisdom to decide what to do in that situation because you have already been given instruction not to steal your neighbor's chainsaw. And so all you need is obedience. You need to go and tell your neighbor, hey, buddy, you left your chainsaw at the end of the driveway. You should put it away. But there are lots of situations in life that God has not given us clear and specific instructions. Should your kids go to Christian school so they get a deeper understanding of God's word in their daily life? Or should they go to public school so they're in more connection with non-Christians to give opportunities for the gospel? Should you take that job in your current company? Or should you go to that other startup company down the road that's offering you a job, but they're just getting started and you're not sure how that's going to go? What do you do about the person, your adult child married, that they've brought into your family, and there's something about them that's changing the dynamic in your family, and you feel like they're pulling your child away from the rest of the family? There are no clear instructions for how to deal with those situations. They require wisdom. And we have to learn the values and the ways of God and then learn how to apply those day by day in these situations. The New Testament speaks of it another way. It tells us that we're saved by faith. It's a done deal. Acts 16:31 says, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. But it also says in Philippians 2:12 to work out your salvation. We have to figure out how our salvation looks in various situations of life. What do I do in this relationship, in this ethical situation, in this church disintegration, in this family problem? What do I do? How does my salvation look here? How am I supposed to live the ways of God in this? It has to be decided and worked out. And Solomon shows us that these worldviews based on wisdom or foolishness result in action. Wisdom is not just knowledge, it is lived. It is put into action. He shows us he personifies the actions of wisdom and the actions of foolishness in two more women in the book of Proverbs. The first one is called the adulterous woman. Now, a person who says there is no God is not going to care what God has to say about the way they live. They will feel self-indulgent. They will feel free to disregard the moral standards of God in order to feed their own desires and lusts. And who gets hurt is irrelevant. You can hurt somebody else's family. You can hurt other people. It doesn't matter because you're just doing what feels good for you. No one has the right to tell you differently because there is no God and no objective standard of morality. And God uses the imagery of sexual unfaithfulness in the Old Testament, adultery, as a metaphor for spiritual unfaithfulness. Because a sexual adulteress, a sexually unfaithful person, does not care who they hurt. They don't care if they hurt their spouse, their kids, the other person's spouse or family, their church. It doesn't matter. You're just fulfilling your own desires. And so it is an excellent metaphor for spiritual unfaithfulness. And this worldview that there is no God results in actions that ignore the standards of God and often cause harm to other people. And this particular woman, let me read you some of the verses from Proverbs about the adulterous woman. Then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent. She is unruly and defiant. Her feet never stay at home. And now in the street, now in the squares, in every corner, she lurks. She took hold of him and kissed him. And with a brazen face, she said, today I fulfilled my vows, and I have food from my fellowship offering at home. So I came out to meet you. I looked for you, and I have found you. And she took hold, I have perfumed my bed with myrrh and aloes and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deeply of love till morning and enjoy ourselves with love. My husband is not at home. He's gone away on a long journey. This is an example of a worldview of foolishness lived. It results in self-indulgent, uncaring actions that harm others. But Solomon has personified the actions of wisdom in one other woman in the book, and that is the woman in Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31. I did not put the passage up because you're going to spend a few minutes in it in your discussion. Now, some of you are saying, hold on a minute, Proverbs 31 is not a personification. Proverbs 31 is a list of duties for wives. Girls, you'll be happy to know that is not true. You'll be relieved because that woman is impossible to live up to. She is Wonder Woman. She never sleeps. She makes all her own clothes. She owns businesses. She is impossible and terrifying to try to live up to. I do not believe that this is an actual woman. It is a personification of wisdom lived. Some of the guys are going, shoot. I'm disappointed in that. Spiritual wisdom lived out results in godly actions. One of the things we learn from the life of Solomon is that having wisdom is not a guarantee you're going to use it or live it. I want to jump back into the story of Solomon for a minute and give you an example. And this is a portion that you did not do in your study. It's back in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. So if you have your Bible, you can have a look there, but I will put it up here. And we're going to start at verse 14 and read to the end of the chapter. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in chariot cities, and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kue. The royal merchants purchased them from Kue at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150, and they exported them to all of the kings of the Hittites and the Armenians. So you're going, okay, so Solomon likes horses. What's that got to do with anything? Well, actually, quite a lot, because God has put this here as a contrast for what went just before. God has something to say about the king's accumulation of horses. Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. Man, I have trouble with this little button. Here we go. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. And then in Psalm 20, verse 7, David said, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. See, in the ancient world, horses were not for trail riding on a sunny Saturday or rounding up your cattle on your Alberta ranch. They were not for competing in dressage competitions. They were for war. They were the equivalent of buying a squadron of fighter planes or having the latest laser-guided smart bombs. If you had horses, you had an incredible advantage over your neighboring nation that only had foot soldiers. You could run them down and defeat them easily. It made you able to outmaneuver them and outnumber them. And God had told Israel they were not to acquire horses because Israel already had a champion. They had the Lord. He was to fight for them. He was the one who was going to win their battles. They were not to go and get horses. And when Solomon did it, he's demonstrating a lack of trust in God's protection. When Tikva and Greg and I were taping one of these podcasts, we were chatting after the taping, and Greg said something that I thought was bang on. He said it seemed as if Solomon is hedging his bets. Yeah, Lord, you promised to be our defender, our champion who fights our battles, but just in case you don't come through, I'm going to get some horses. And he got a lot of them. He laid aside the wisdom God had given him, and he acted in human wisdom. He spent the money God had given him that he did not ask for as a gift, and he bought horses just in case God didn't come through. Having wisdom from God still requires a decision to act in godly wisdom. In fact, this is a daily decision on a wide variety of situations. Human wisdom permeates our thinking. We're so used to it, we don't even recognize it. But it's in conflict with the wisdom of God. And we have to make daily, moment-by-moment decisions to act in the wisdom God gives and not in the human wisdom that comes so naturally to us. So, for discussion, 2 questions for you. What are some examples of wisdom from God that contradicts the wisdom of the world? And how can you be on guard against the inclination to act in human wisdom? And then I want you to look at Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, and try to view this as a personification of wisdom lived and see what these actions that are listed are actually saying about the person's character. This is going to take some thinking for you. This is not an easy thing to switch over to looking at it this way. But let me give you an example. Verse 18 of that passage says, her lamp does not go out. Now, when I was a kid, I thought, she works all night, like she doesn't sleep. This is insane. Who can do this? I don't want to be this woman. But that's not what it means. In the ancient world, if you offered hospitality to travelers, you put a lamp in your window. And so if you did not want to offer hospitality, you would put it out. When you went to bed, you would put it out. But hers does not go out. This is a person who is willing to inconvenience herself to get up and offer hospitality. So there is a generosity in the attitude and in the actions that are being portrayed. So that's kind of the way I want you to think about it as you look at Proverbs 31. Look at the people in that passage that are affected. There are a number of people groups that are spoken about, and see how they are affected by wisdom lived. If you can start to see this chapter in a different way, you might find it really insightful on what it means to live wisely.